put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Island That Disappeared. There's a small island in the Bahamas where the sand still whispers secrets of a forgotten empire. For 3 years in the early 1980s, Norman's Cay was not a tropical paradise. It was the most sophisticated drug trafficking hub the world had ever seen, moving 2 tons of cocaine into America every single day. The man who built this empire wasn't your typical drug lord. He was a visionary businessman who studied Hitler, loved John Lennon, and pioneered financial strategies so advanced that Fortune 500 companies would later adopt them. His name was Carlos Lehder, and before Pablo Escobar became a household name, Lehder had already revolutionized the cocaine industry with an innovation so simple, yet so devastating, that it changed the economics of the drug trade forever. This is the dark business story of the man who transformed cocaine from a luxury product into a mass-market commodity, and the chilling price he paid when his empire finally collapsed. Carlos Lehder Rivas was born in 1949 in Armenia, Colombia, to a German engineer father and Colombian mother. His childhood was marked by privilege that dissolved into chaos when his parents divorced, leaving young Carlos caught between 2 worlds: the disciplined Germanic influence of his father and the passionate Latin culture of his mother. This duality would later define his approach to business: cold calculation married to explosive ambition. By his early 20s, Lehder had already tasted the American dream and found it wanting. He moved to New York in the late 1960s, working odd jobs, selling used cars, and eventually dabbling in small-time marijuana smuggling. But it wasn't until 1974, when he was arrested for car theft and sentenced to time in a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, that his true education began. Behind bars, Lehder wasn't learning to be a better criminal. He was learning to be a better businessman. In that Connecticut prison, Carlos Lehder met a man who would change everything: George Jung, a cocaine smuggler from Massachusetts who understood the American market like few others. Together, in whispered conversations during yard time and late-night cell talks, they mapped out what would become the blueprint for modern narco-trafficking. Jung had the connections and market knowledge. Lehder had something more dangerous: vision. When Lehder was released in 1975 and deported back to Colombia, he didn't return defeated. He returned with a revolutionary business model that would make him one of the wealthiest criminals in history. At the time, cocaine was being smuggled into the United States in small quantities, hidden in suitcases, swallowed in condoms, or taped to the bodies of desperate mules. The logistics were inefficient, the risk was enormous, and the profit margins, while substantial, were limited by scale. Lehder saw what others missed: a supply chain problem that could be solved with 20th century innovation. His solution was brutally simple: aircraft. But not just any aircraft. He envisioned a fleet of small planes making regular runs from Colombia to the United States, bypassing traditional border controls entirely, creating an aerial highway for cocaine that could move product at unprecedented volumes. The genius wasn't just in the idea, it was in the execution and the financial structuring behind it. Lehder understood that to move tons of cocaine, he needed infrastructure, and infrastructure required investment capital that most criminals couldn't access or manage. So he did something unprecedented in the criminal underworld. He created a consortium. In 1978, Lehder co-founded what would become the Medellín Cartel alongside Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, and José Rodríguez Gacha. But Lehder's role was unique. He wasn't just a partner. He was the logistics director. the transportation minister of cocaine, the man who solved the most critical bottleneck in their business model. His innovation transformed cocaine from a niche luxury product, consumed by wealthy elites, into a mass-market commodity available on street corners across America. The economic impact was staggering. Wholesale prices dropped by 70% between 1980 and 1984, as volume increased exponentially. But Lehder's ambitions went far beyond simply flying drugs from point A to point B. He wanted control, total, absolute control over every aspect of his supply chain. And so in 1978, he set his sights on Norman's Cay, a pristine 5-kilometer-long island in the Bahamas, home to fewer than 36 residents and a small airstrip. What Lehder did next revealed the depth of his business acumen and the darkness of his methods. He didn't invade the island. He bought it, piece by piece, using front companies, Bahamian intermediaries, and carefully placed bribes. Within months, he had acquired most of the valuable property, including a yacht club, a runway, and multiple homes. Those who refused to sell found themselves terrorized by Lehder's security forces. Armed guards who patrolled the island day and night, weapons drawn, making it clear that Norman's Cay was now a sovereign territory of the Medellín Cartel. The transformation of Norman's Cay stands as one of the most brazen examples of criminal enterprise, operating as legitimate business in modern history. Lehder extended the runway to accommodate larger aircraft. He installed sophisticated radar and communications equipment to track approaching law enforcement. He built warehouses to store cocaine, awaiting transport to the mainland United States. He even established refueling stations and maintenance facilities, creating a fully operational private airport that ran with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 logistics operation. But here's what very few people know, the detail that remained classified in DEA files for decades. Norman's Cay wasn't just a transit point for cocaine. It was a money laundering laboratory where Lehder pioneered financial techniques that would later be studied in MBA programs. Using offshore banking structures, shell corporations, and real estate investments, Lehder was washing hundreds of millions of dollars through legitimate businesses, creating a financial empire that was nearly impossible to trace. He owned hotels, shopping centers, construction companies, and airlines, all purchased with drug money, all generating legal income that further obscured his criminal operations. The numbers were staggering. At the height of Norman's Cay operations between 1979 and 1982, Lehder's organization was moving an estimated $300 million worth of cocaine into the United States every month. His personal wealth was estimated at $2.7 billion, making him one of the richest men in the world. Richer than most Fortune 500 CEOs. Richer than oil magnates. Richer than anyone who'd earned their fortune legally. But with wealth came paranoia. And with paranoia came a descent into megalomania that would ultimately prove his undoing. Carlos Lehder wasn't satisfied being rich. He wanted to be powerful, not just in the underworld, but in the legitimate political arena as well. And here's where his story takes a turn into territory so dark it seems almost fictional, except every word is documented truth. Lehder idolized two seemingly contradictory figures, Adolf Hitler and John Lennon. From Hitler, he took an obsession with racial purity and authoritarian control, despite his own mixed heritage. From Lenin, he adopted a countercultural, anti-American stance, viewing himself as a revolutionary fighting against U.S. imperialism. This bizarre ideological cocktail manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that began to alarm even his partners in the Medellín Cartel. In 1982, Lehder founded a political party in Colombia called the National Latin Movement, which operated on a platform of anti-imperialism and anti-extradition. He purchased a newspaper and radio station to spread his message. He built housing projects for the poor, distributed food, and positioned himself as a champion of the people, all while running one of the most destructive criminal enterprises in human history. The hypocrisy was stunning, but his public relations campaign was effective enough that he briefly won a seat as an alternate representative in Colombia's Chamber of Representatives. But Lehder's political ambitions revealed something more dangerous than his drug trafficking, a messianic complex that made him believe he was untouchable. On Norman's Cay, he lived like a king, surrounding himself with beautiful women, armed guards, exotic animals, and mountains of cocaine that he consumed with increasing frequency. Former associates would later describe parties that lasted for days, where Lehder would deliver rambling speeches about his destiny to reshape Colombia and destroy American hegemony. His behavior grew more erratic and violent. He ordered executions for minor infractions. He became convinced that everyone around him was an informant or a traitor. His paranoia was so extreme that he installed hidden cameras throughout his properties and would spend hours watching the footage, looking for signs of betrayal. The brilliant businessman who had revolutionized cocaine trafficking was slowly being consumed by the very product he had made so profitable. By 1982, the DEA had finally focused significant resources on Norman's Cay and Carlos Lehder. The island that had operated with impunity for years was now under constant surveillance. Pressure from the U.S. government on the Bahamas increased, and bribes that had once bought silence were no longer sufficient to keep authorities away. Lehder was forced to abandon Norman's Cay in 1982, but he didn't slow down. He adapted. He established new routes through Central America, continued his political activities in Colombia, and expanded his business partnerships within the cartel. But the walls were closing in, and the dark reality of the cocaine business was becoming impossible to ignore. The violence that had always been part of the drug trade was escalating to unprecedented levels. The Medellín Cartel was waging war against the Colombian government, assassinating judges, police officers, journalists, and politicians who opposed them. Pablo Escobar became the public face of this violence. But Lehder was equally complicit, funding operations and providing logistical support for terrorist attacks that killed hundreds of innocent people. The business model that had made them billionaires was now destroying the very society they claimed to champion. Colombia was descending into chaos, and the cartel's political protection was evaporating as even corrupt officials realized that the violence had become unsustainable. But here's the twist that few people understand about Carlos Lehder's downfall. He wasn't captured because of brilliant detective work or a dramatic raid. He was betrayed by his own partners, Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, alarmed by Lehder's increasingly erratic behavior and his political activities that were drawing unwanted attention, made a calculated business decision. Carlos Lehder had become a liability that threatened the entire organization. In February 1987, Colombian authorities received an anonymous tip about Lehder's exact location at a safe house in the mountains outside Medellín. The tip was so precise, so detailed, that it could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the cartel's operations. When Colombian National Police stormed the compound, Lehder was captured without a shot being fired. His legendary security forces mysteriously absent, his escape routes somehow blocked. Within hours, Carlos Lehder was on a plane to the United States, extradited in one of the fastest judicial processes in Colombian history. The man who had fought so publicly against extradition, who had built a political party around preventing this very outcome, found himself in American custody before his lawyers could even file an appeal. The speed and efficiency of his capture strongly suggested that powerful forces, both within the Colombian government and within the cartel itself, wanted him removed from the chessboard immediately. Lehder's trial in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1988 was supposed to be the government's showcase, a chance to expose the inner workings of the Medellín Cartel and secure a conviction against one of its founding members. What they got was far more disturbing. Carlos Lehder defended himself with a bizarre mixture of defiance and delusion. He claimed he was a political prisoner, that his activities were a form of revolutionary resistance against American imperialism. He argued that cocaine trafficking was a legitimate business responding to market demand, a libertarian economic argument that, stripped of its moral implications, wasn't entirely wrong. He portrayed himself as a businessman who had simply operated more efficiently than his competitors, using corporate structures and vertical integration strategies that any Fortune 500 company would admire. The trial revealed details that shocked even seasoned drug enforcement agents. Lehder's organization had generated detailed financial statements, used sophisticated accounting methods, and maintained operational records that looked like they belonged to a multinational corporation, not a criminal enterprise. Witnesses described boardroom-style meetings where market strategies were debated, where expansion plans were analyzed with spreadsheets and projections, where personnel decisions were made based on performance metrics. But beneath this veneer of corporate professionalism lay a darkness that no amount of business sophistication could obscure. The trial also revealed the human cost of Lehder's innovation, the thousands of lives destroyed by cocaine addiction in American cities, the violence that had consumed Colombia, the corruption that had infected entire governments. His efficient business model had flooded the United States with cocaine, at a scale that created a public health crisis lasting decades. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Carlos Lehder was sentenced to life in prison, plus 135 years, with no possibility of parole. At 40 years old, the billionaire narco-financier would never be a free man again. But even in prison, Carlos Lehder had one more card to play, a card so valuable that it would eventually buy him something he thought he'd lost forever: freedom. In the early 1990s, facing life in a maximum security American prison, Lehder made a decision that would have been unthinkable for any traditional drug lord. He became a cooperating witness. The man who had co-founded the Medellín Cartel, who had pioneered the logistics that made it the most powerful criminal organization in the world, agreed to testify against his former partner, Pablo Escobar, and other cartel members. In 1991, Lehder's testimony was instrumental in providing U.S. authorities with detailed information about the cartel's operations, financial networks, and political connections. His insider knowledge was so valuable that prosecutors used it to build cases against dozens of traffickers and corrupt officials. He had become what he most despised: an informant, the ultimate betrayal in the code of the criminal underworld. His cooperation didn't immediately free him, but it started a process that would take decades to complete. After serving more than 30 years in U.S. federal prisons, moving between maximum security facilities, always under special protective custody, due to the price on his head from former associates, Carlos Lehder's sentence was quietly reduced. In June 2020, at the age of 70, he was released from American custody and deported to Germany, taking advantage of his dual citizenship from his German father. Today, Carlos Lehder lives in obscurity somewhere in Germany, a ghostly remnant of an empire that reshaped the global drug trade and left an indelible mark on American society. Unlike Pablo Escobar, who died in a dramatic rooftop shootout, or Jorge Ochoa, who served minimal time and returned to Colombia, Lehder's ending is more ambiguous: neither martyrdom nor triumph, just a quiet dissolution into anonymity. The story of Carlos Lehder isn't just about one man's rise and fall. It's a case study in how business innovation can be applied to destructive ends, how brilliant strategic thinking can create empires built on human suffering, and how the pursuit of wealth and power can corrode every moral boundary until nothing remains but ambition and paranoia. Lehder's innovations in transportation logistics, supply chain management, and financial structuring were genuinely revolutionary. Business schools now teach the same principles he pioneered: vertical integration, control of distribution channels, economies of scale, geographic diversification of assets, sophisticated money laundering through legitimate business acquisitions. The difference is that legitimate businesses use these strategies to create value, while Lehder used them to flood American streets with a product that destroyed families, fueled violent crime, and contributed to the incarceration of millions. The cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which Lehder's logistical genius helped create, had social consequences that rippled through American society for generations. The crack crisis devastated inner cities, destroyed communities, and led to harsh sentencing laws that created mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale. The war on drugs, launched partially in response to the flood of cocaine that Lehder's innovation enabled, cost billions of dollars, filled prisons, and failed to substantially reduce drug use. In Colombia, the violence unleashed by the Medellín Cartel, which Lehder helped fund and arm, killed an estimated 46,000 people during the cartel's reign. Judges were assassinated, journalists were murdered, politicians were intimidated into silence, and entire government institutions were corrupted or destroyed. The country spent decades recovering from the trauma, and in some regions, the damage is still visible today. But perhaps the darkest lesson of Carlos Lehder's story is how easily business acumen can be divorced from ethical consideration. Lehder saw himself as an entrepreneur, an innovator, a revolutionary, never as a mass murderer, which is what his business model made him. He could calculate profit margins, optimize supply chains, and build corporate structures, but he never calculated the human cost of his efficiency. Or perhaps he did calculate it and simply didn't care. Even now, decades after Norman's Cay was abandoned and the Medellín Cartel was dismantled, troubling questions remain about Carlos Lehder's empire. Questions that whisper of secrets still buried in classified files and offshore accounts. How much of his wealth was recovered? Official estimates suggest that billions of dollars remain hidden in shell corporations, real estate investments, and bank accounts scattered across dozens of countries. Despite his cooperation with U.S. authorities, Lehder never revealed the full extent of his financial network. Some of those assets may still be generating income, controlled by proxies and intermediaries who have no connection to the drug trade. What did he really tell prosecutors during his years of cooperation? The full details of Lehder's testimony remain sealed, but hints suggest that he provided information not just about drug trafficking, but about political corruption at the highest levels. Connections that implicated officials in multiple countries, including the United States. Some researchers believe that certain investigations were quietly shelved because the revelations would have been too politically damaging. And most disturbingly, how many people adopted his business model? The techniques Lehder pioneered didn't die with the Medellín Cartel. They evolved, became more sophisticated, and spread to other criminal organizations worldwide. Modern drug trafficking operations still use variations of his logistical innovations, his financial structures, his understanding of supply and demand economics. In a very real sense, Carlos Lehder didn't just build an empire. He created a template that continues to generate billions of dollars in illegal profits decades after his capture. There's a photograph of Carlos Lehder from 1981, taken at the height of his power on Norman's Cay. He's standing on a beach at sunset, young and confident, wearing expensive clothes, with the ocean stretching endlessly behind him. In his hand is a drink, and on his face is a smile that suggests he believes he's invincible, that he's discovered the secret to unlimited wealth and power. But if you look closely at that photograph, if you study the eyes behind the smile, you can see something else, a hollowness, a darkness that no amount of money could fill. The billionaire narco-financier who revolutionized cocaine trafficking, who built an island empire and corrupted governments, who pioneered business strategies that would influence both criminal enterprises and legitimate corporations. He never understood that the system he created would inevitably consume him. Today, somewhere in Germany, an old man walks streets that don't remember his name, carrying secrets that governments would prefer stay buried, living on money whose origins remain deliberately obscure. Carlos Lehder survived when so many of his associates died violently. But survival isn't the same as escape. The empire is gone, the power is lost, the wealth is scattered. But the consequences of his innovations remain, poisoning communities, fueling violence, and reminding us that business genius without moral constraint is perhaps the most dangerous force in human commerce. And on Norman's Cay, the sand still whispers those secrets, secrets of an empire that proved you can build a fortune on human suffering, but you can never truly escape the darkness you create. Because in the end, Carlos Lehder's most lasting legacy isn't his wealth or his innovation. It's the reminder that every business decision has a moral dimension, and that the most efficient path to profit is sometimes paved with the destruction of everything we claim to value. The cocaine still flows, the violence continues, and the financial structures he pioneered remain, a dark monument to a brilliant mind that chose power over principle, and paid a price that money could never measure. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.